Hello and welcome to Deep Learning Leaders. My name is Eric Landau and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Encord, the data development platform for AI teams. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Kwin Kramer, co-founder of Daily, a real-time voice, video, and AI platform for developers. Thank you, Kwin, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm very curious on your work on Daily and also in PipeCat, which is quite a popular open source repo. But before we get into that, I really want to dive into like your previous experience in, let's say, the big data era, because we have chatted before, and you've seen the transition from the kind of old way that enterprises and the world was thinking about data to this new AI era of data. So I'm curious, maybe just to get a little bit of context of what you did in a previous life, and how the world has shifted in the last 10 to 20 years in the time that you've seen.
It's funny, I've been like on the edges of machine learning and AI for a long time, and now it feels like AI is eating the world, and that background is partly useful and partly not, because everything is so new. I did a bunch of genetic algorithm stuff in grad school alongside a bunch of other work. I was really lucky to kind of randomly land at the MIT Media Lab in the very late 1990s when a bunch of new internet stuff and hardware and Internet of Things and virtual characters and new educational technology and new film making technologies were all getting built at the Media Lab. So I saw this kind of amazing, like early internet bubbling of incredibly interesting ideas. And then I started a kind of Web 1.0 company, and then I moved to LA and started a kind of big data new operating system for using computers company with crazy ambitions with a friend from the Media Lab. My friend John was the guy who designed the gestural interfaces in the film Minority Report,
Oh
and
yeah.
we made those systems for real.
Whoa.
Started out kind of as a science fair project, engineers building something they wanted, and then gradually figured out how to productize that and sell it to Fortune 500 companies and government agencies and other folks who needed like really big data visualization environments, like room-sized computing environments that a bunch of people could go into and collaborate on like very large data visualization or collaborative problems. And then we could connect to those rooms over the internet, so you could have multiple people in a room and then multiple rooms all over the world. Really fun, really exciting project. And we built a bunch of big data and machine learning stuff for that, connections to various kinds of analytic tools, but also the gestural interfaces were a bunch of computer vision driven
Yeah.
stuff.
And did people actually use the gestural interfaces in the visualizations or in kind of manipulating data around?
They really did, which was super fun, because once you kind of got used to using those rooms, you could kind of point at any screen and move things around, and then you could use your hands in 3 space to like change visualization parameters. So we built lots of demos, and then our customer, the development teams, and in our that we sold these systems to, built lots of big data visualization stuff that used these gestural interfaces. The problem was they were too expensive for mass market. So there was a relatively small population of people using them, but the people using them loved them. I was super excited when Vision Pro shipped this year, because it felt
Yeah.
like the hand tracking in the Vision Pro was like the first thing I'd seen that was close to mass market that could do the things we had done 15 years ago at Oblong. And I still think that's a huge area where there's going to be, over the next 5 years or so, some really amazing stuff gets built as that level of hand tracking and eye tracking continues to kind of get more and more accessible.
Were there other ideas or prototypes that you remember from the Media Lab back in the day that either took a very long time to actually mature or hit the market, or still maybe underappreciated? And because being in the Media Lab, you're kind of getting a preview of the future, and some things instantiate and some things don't. Were there anything things that when you were there you were excited about, and either made it into the real world or didn't?
The first one, and the one that I think was really obvious when you were inside the Media Lab that it would happen, and it actually didn't take that long. It took maybe 10 years or something, was Internet of Things. So now we have all these connected devices all over our lives, and the Internet of Things stuff was significantly developed kind of inside the Media Lab in the late 90s, to a degree I think most people probably don't know because it's just become so ubiquitous. And that there were a few people really pushing kind of that research agenda forward at the Media Lab. And it just seemed very clear as you were building on that stuff or working in offices next to those folks that, oh yeah, every device is going to have a chip in it. The one I think about most often today is there was a professor named Bruce Bloomberg in the late 90s who was building a virtual dog character. And you could kind of walk in. It was it moved around the lab, but it was like projected on a big screen. And when you walked by the wall, the dog would like say hi to you and interact with you, and it would interact with you sort of in a pretty crude way, linguistically and visually, but certainly state of the art at the time. Well, now we can all build these virtual characters with LLMs, and they're great. And I think about Bruce Bloomberg's virtual dog like almost every day.
Yeah, you can have a dog GPT where it knows which woof or which pant to do at different kind of environmental cues.
You completely can, and in fact, I just ordered a robot dog for a hackathon, in a couple weeks, and I'm gonna try to build with some friends. I'm gonna try to build a really fun kind of LLM powered, vision capable, voice capable robot dog.
Yeah, I saw one of those at a conference, and it was very popular, but it still has this uncanny valley type feeling to it, where it's not quite there yet, and there's some natural suspicion that I think my human ape brain still feels when I see kind of a metal dog. But we'll probably cross the chasm at some point, and it's just like an aesthetic problem essentially to solve. I don't know if like you have another view on that.
No, I agree. The uncanny valley is something I think about a lot now that I thought about a lot at the Media Lab too, and then didn't think that much about, for many years. As I'm sure we'll talk about, I think the voice interaction stuff has passed over to the far side of the uncanny valley now. Not that you can't tell sometimes when you're talking to an LLM or when a voice is synthetically generated, but it's so good that you don't care, and it's not weird. I don't think the robots are there yet, but I do think the conversational AI is there, which honestly is not something I expected 2 years ago, and it's kind of an amazing new capability that we're just starting to figure out how to use.
And I'm really curious to kind of dive in there. Maybe a last question on the data visualization, because it's fascinating that this existed where there's rooms of people being able to do hand gestures and kind of zoom screens in and out. What kinds of use cases were you actually seeing? Like what were people actually visualizing in those rooms and sharing, collaborating at mass scale?
Lots of scientific data visualization, so like big geophysical surveys, and the people who pay for big geophysical surveys are drilling for oil, mostly, but not completely. Some academic big data visualization too, which was really fun to sort of collaborate with academics on. Most of the academic stuff we did was around healthcare, so like are there better ways to look at MRI and other kind of scans, that stuff which I didn't know before we worked with those folks. That stuff is so much data. Like an MRI is just a massive amount of data, and so how do you visualize that stuff? And you can now do some automated processing on it with LLMs that I think is another layer, but just like unlocking the human visual pattern matching is also super interesting. Logistics, so like complicated logistics systems, supply chains, shipping systems, airline planning, air traffic control, and then some people bought those rooms just for really amazing boardrooms, like presentations. So you would like just put super interesting, only minimally interactive, but like lots and lots of data around.
Right. Probably no one remember the information, but they all remember the experience of being in the room and seeing the presentation at some point.
Really good visualization shouldn't be underestimated. Like we are significantly like visual creatures, and figuring out how to represent information in ways that like partly has emotional impact, partly we can process it really well is so powerful. I mean, I think lots of us who are in tech are fans of like the Tufte books about data visualization for good reason.
What do you think most people get wrong about visualization? Like, are there kind of common mistakes or failure modes that you see in tech or otherwise when you're kind of seeing data in the real world?
Well, what I will say is that I do think interactivity makes a big difference. Like if you can move around the data or change the parameters dynamically, that adds way more than a little bit to
Mm.
ability to understand data. So static data visualization obviously really valuable. Dynamic data visualization is both hard and really, really valuable.
Interesting. So I'm curious on the story of how you started Daily and kind of the trajectory of the company. And you're working on some very cool things in real time AI, but I'm just kind of interested in the original, or the origin story essentially.
Well, what we built at Oblong was effectively a big networked operating system. And the stuff that I gravitate towards is large scale, low latency networking things. So that was kind of the piece of that was more my baby. I loved the gestural interfaces, but most of what I worked on was like moving data around really fast between lots of devices and lots of screens and lots of rooms. So we built lots of custom video and audio and data networking stuff. Lots of it we had to build custom because we were, in the dark ages, right before some of the newer standards and hardware availability. So when I took a couple years off after Daily, sort of the thing that was stuck in my mind was how do we give every person building a product like the ability to build these like audio, video, data communications features. I really felt like the internet was getting more and more video centric, and real time video and audio were going to be a big part of kind of everything we all do online. And there was a standard just getting kind of developed inside Google that was getting some traction with industry players outside of Google called WebRTC. And I thought, WebRTC is like the building block for this kind of next era of real-time communications. And they're going to need to be really good developer tools for it. And I really like building network stuff. And I really like, sort of audio and video, low latency, codec engineering, like all that. That's the stack that I gravitate towards. So what if we started a company to build like incredibly good infrastructure and developer tools that would let anybody who's like designing a web app or a iOS app or an Android app to like have real-time audio, video, and data like right there at their fingertips. So that was the idea behind Daily, was make real-time audio and video developer tools super accessible.
And you've picked up, I'm sure, a lot of the AI boom in the last few years. But before that happened, like what were the main use cases that you were seeing?
It was things like telehealth, educational live streaming and teaching and tutoring, lots of workplace collaboration. So embedding, audio and video calls into applications for communicating with your colleagues. A fair amount of social and gaming, live commerce, dating apps, pretty broad range of things. But you're definitely right that set of use cases now feels like only a very small part of what we are going to want to do with real-time communication over the next few years, because talking to LLMs is so useful, and today's state-of-the-art LLMs are capable of these conversational interactions that are total step function changes in what computers can do. So now at Daily, like we're developer tools for real-time audio, video, and AI, and the AI use cases just feel both new and exciting, and also really, really big. Partly because there's this interesting dynamic where, and I never would have quite conceived of it like this, but when we talk to other people, we're bandwidth limited by the availability of other people. But LLMs just are scalable. Like you're not like you're limited only by how many units NVIDIA can ship this quarter, right? So you can do all kinds of things. Like we have a customer that does job interviewing, and traditionally, like our Daily is used inside their like recruiting platform for the video call job interviews. And I think lots of people are now trying to build at least the first loop of job interviewing to be done by LLMs. There's some really good things about that. I think there's some things to figure out to make sure that works well for people. But it's clearly driven partly by the fact that LLMs are scalable and people aren't. And you can do a first round interview loop with a bunch more people if you can do a good job with it with an LLM.
How long after ChatGPT came out did this use case really start to pop up in terms of what you were seeing in the market, and in terms of maybe how you're adjusting your roadmap or your focus or your marketing distribution? Was it immediately on both sides, or did it take a while for it to percolate and for people to realize that LLMs could operate in this real-time capacity?
It, in AI terms, it took a little while. Everything feels very, very accelerated over the last 2 years. But like we at Daily sort of figured it out, at least started to figure it out, like basically when GPT-4 came out. Like before GPT-4, we definitely hadn't really kind of looked at this or seen the potential. But GPT-4 was so good at conversation, sort of broadly defined. We were like, oh, we could hook this up to audio, to turn user speech into text, text to GPT-4, text out of GPT-4, turn that text coming out of GPT-4 back into speech, and it's a super compelling experience. Now, like where the monetizable use cases are or where the safe enterprise use cases are initially, we don't necessarily know. This was like kind of, I guess, April, May, June, like 2 years ago, right? But it's clearly very, very compelling. So we built a bunch of stuff internally, almost hackathon style. And then we did start having customers come to us for new AI use cases unlocked by GPT-4. The first ones were not real time. The first ones were using transcriptions from video calls. So things like taking a telehealth visit and turning it into, the notes in the format that healthcare professionals need to write after every encounter.
Yeah.
And that's such a huge time savings, and LLMs were able to do that there was a whole lot of customer pull for it as soon as people realized that ChatGPT could do it. And one of the interesting drivers for that was, IT people at healthcare companies were very skeptical. They were like, well, this stuff hallucinates and we need to test it with different language inputs and we're going to put up a bunch of roadblocks. Totally understandably, because like healthcare is extremely serious and regulated. Doctors and nurses were just recording stuff and feeding it into ChatGPT. And that's a huge HIPAA violation. So on the one hand, you've got like the techies wanting to go slow. And on the other hand, you have healthcare professionals who are saving themselves 10, 15 hours a week of work that's not the work that actually goes into like serving patients. That tension resolved itself actually pretty quickly. People figuring out, okay, we're going to build the right guardrails, we're going to build the right evals, and we're going to figure out how to roll this stuff out. We sort of saw the same thing with a bunch of use cases. Customer support, like voice-to-voice customer support, kind of went through that arc next. The enterprise ROI and the quality of the experience of customer support, if you can like use an LLM really well, so clear, there's starting to be like mass adoption of that. And I think we're just going to go through that for a bunch of use cases, and it's happening at pretty accelerated rate.
Do you think the stack, even for some of these early use cases like customer support, is basically there and it's mature enough to handle scalable usage and distribution across multiple enterprise types, or is there something missing in the actual tech stack itself? Like, do we have any gaps that we need to plug either now immediately or maybe in terms of tail risks or other challenges that might come up in the future?
For the first generation of voice-to-voice use cases, the whole stack is there. The gaps are mostly in developer tools, developer know-how, and just kind of rolling that stuff out in a real-world ecosystem. It's definitely still a little bit challenging to build what you need for, say, a really great customer support experience. You need to figure out like how to get the LLM to kind of follow a script, and you need to save the right parts of the conversation in the right back-end systems. So it's not something you can just sort of flip a switch on, but all the pieces are there, and we are starting to see customers roll that stuff out in production use at scale. This is, I think, something a bunch of folks have said on your podcast. If we stopped all AI progress today, we would still have several years worth of harvesting the benefits of the tools we have right now today.
Yeah.
It's also true that progress isn't stopping and that the core tools are continuing to get better. So there's sort of two tailwinds right now behind AI adoption, in my opinion.
And you kind of mentioned it fleetingly, but how do you think about evals in this potentially quite nuanced and niche set of use cases? where it's hard to have, one rubric to solve, to say, okay, the model is doing a good job here or not. Is that a solved problem for the customer support segment, or is there something missing on that front as well?
I mean, I'm curious to hear what you think of this. I think you could make a good argument that evals are sort of the single biggest missing piece for adoption of kind of AI, generative AI tools across the board. It's just really, really hard today to do good evals. And there's a bunch of tooling components that I think need to continue to improve to make that easier. But you're closer to, I mean, in general, you're closer to evals than I am.
The thesis that we have is that the missing component is actually good human in the loop tooling as well, because in general it's quite difficult to have a model evaluate a very difficult problem is almost as hard as solving that difficult problem in the first place. So ideally you don't train a new GPT-5 to evaluate GPT-5, but you can probably get away with one, good heuristics, good kind of lower level models, and some human judgment to make up the gap. And together, you can probably put together like a pretty robust system. To solve it by itself, technically, I think is quite challenging and is, I think I agree. It's one of the most difficult things in this Gen AI paradigm that we've seen.
That makes sense to me, what you're saying. I see specifically in the voice space that models and eval tools and every other part of the stack are moving more towards being multimodal native, which is a good thing. Like it's been hard to even like save audio snippets in tooling. You had to build it sort of yourself. That's changing, and there's some specific use case specific targeted tooling now getting built. Like we work with a couple of partners who are very new at this, but are building good stuff for voice-to-voice evals and voice-to-voice synthetic data. So we work with a company called Canonical that's building some dashboard stuff, which is good. Work with a company called Koval, which is building some synthetic data stuff. I love what you're doing. I think there's just a big gap that hopefully will get filled in the next few months.
Well, a few months, yeah. Who knows? I think at this rate. What do you see as the future of this kind of multimodal shift, and how does multimodal play in what Daily is doing? Is the video component going to come in, and we're going to be not only talking to LMs but also talking to their avatar?
Yeah, I mean, all my opinion, I don't think this is controversial, is that all the big state-of-the-art models are going to become sort of natively multimodal input and output over time. So that's audio, imagery, video. Right now, the best native audio model is GPT-4o, variants of GPT-4o, which are super, super impressive. Probably not quite there yet for most of the enterprise use cases we serve commercially today. But totally there in terms of like great audio in, audio understanding, audio out quality. The open weights models are going to go that direction. I assume the other labs competing with OpenAI are going to go that direction, and that is a big step function improvement in quality. If the models continue to get more multimodal with audio. Video is coming along right behind. We have a bunch of partners who are building real-time video generation models, and they're super fun to talk to. And they feel like maybe they're like a year and a half behind where the text and audio LLMs are, but pretty soon we're going to have virtual avatars that I think are on the other side of the uncanny valley too.
That's crazy. Yeah, we'll be doing this podcast. Both of us will be just our VLM representatives will be doing the podcast rather than while we go and drink a scotch or something somewhere. So is OpenAI, because they're doing kind of natively the voice to voice, but are they a cut ahead of everyone, or are the quality of other models like sufficient even if you have to do this translation layer from audio to text? Are there any other like strong contenders that you've seen in the space at the moment?
Our customers are using GPT-4, Claude, Llama, some other models, but those are the big three. I do think that for the voice-to-voice use cases, right now the best stack is still transcription, GPT-4 text, voice generation, because
Mm.
you get a combination of like quality of the model and low enough latency for the whole stack that it's sort of the right sweet spot. But as with everything in AI, I definitely think evolution towards sort of native audio in and out is going to happen. And that will simplify part of the stack, but the whole sort of enterprise orchestration loop, you will still need kind of lots of tooling around all the things you have to do, like content moderation and
Mm.
function calling and integration with backend systems and managing the history of the conversation. All those things are still going to, you're still going to wrap a lot of tooling around these models.
And are there any failure modes in the core model stack that you see? So in the transcription side of things, or in the LLM quality, or in some other kind of, so I know that interruptions tends to be an issue in voice AI. Like, where do you see like the biggest problems now in terms of like the real time voice AI stack?
The things we help customers most with are actually now building the application logic. So how do you kind of script the LLM through a multi-turn conversation that lasts several minutes? Because the LLM is very good, sort of raw conversational ability, but guiding it to say get answers to a few important questions and kind of maybe do RAG based on the answers to those questions dynamically, so that you go kind of down the conversation tree the way a human customer support agent would, is still something we're kind of helping customers build from scratch and trying to build better and better tooling for. Mostly open source tooling, because we really think like open source tooling for this stuff is unlocking lots of growth in the ecosystem. There are a few technical things that kind of are solved problems, but not everybody knows they're solved problems. Things like using WebRTC instead of WebSockets for real-time audio to make sure that kind of across the whole range of real-world network conditions you see, your calls actually work. You mentioned interruptions. If you try to build interruption handling from scratch, it's a few weeks of work or more if you've never done it before. That stuff exists now in like the PipeCat open source framework where it just works for you. So while things like phrase endpointing, interruption handling are going to continue to get better, they're clearly at the 80/20 point where they're not the blocker for rolling this stuff out now.
And you you mentioned open source and PipeCat. I'm curious for you to kind of explain what PipeCat is, how people are using it, and what the inspiration behind it was.
Oh yeah. So when we started building this stuff, as we talked about, like when GPT-4o came out, we kind of had to figure out all the stuff we were just talking about. Like, how do you know when the LLM is done talking, which is called phrase endpointing? Right? Sorry, when the human is done talking and the LLM should respond, which is called phrase endpointing or turn detection. How do you handle interruptions so that if the human starts talking again, the LLM immediately stops talking, but you retain the conversational context, through that interruption? How do you like handle function calling in kind of a multi-turn conversation, and not have to sort of write every bit of that logic from scratch every time? There's like 7 or 8, depending on how you count, like things you just kind of have to build if you're building this stuff from scratch to even get to the point where you're worried about the application logic. So we built that stuff internally, as you often do, like 2 or 3 different times before we felt like we got it right. And then we started noticing that everybody who was starting to be interested in voice AI was having to go through that same, like, build it from scratch process. And we thought, oh, well, we've got this really good tooling and we want to see more great stuff get built here. And like our commercial model is just to kind of move the packets around the network. So we should just release this stuff as open source. And we honestly didn't think that hard about it. We were just having fun working on it and thought it was great to release it. And then it got a huge amount of traction.
Yeah.
So we started seeing people build, and when we released it, we were like, this doesn't need to be daily specific. It is like it should be just for the community. And pretty quickly we started seeing people build like network transport plugins for Twilio. We were like, oh, that's interesting. Okay, I guess we sort of knew that would happen, and now we're actually seeing it happen. I think that's a good thing. And so now there's like a huge community of people building on PipeCat for voice-to-voice and now real-time video applications. And what you get in PipeCat is this orchestration framework, this set of building blocks that lets you hook multiple models together in a processing pipeline that lets you swap out whatever pieces of the pipeline you want because they're sort of abstracted, like APIs for each kind of service you would use, abstractions for function calling, extremely low latency buffering for every part of the pipeline, abstractions for the network transport, so you can use WebRTC or WebSockets or long-lived HTTP connections. There's a local transport that needs more love, so you can just sort of do PipeCat stuff right on your local machine, which is something hardware, like AI hardware companies are starting to do. So you've got this sort of set of building blocks that almost has coalesced to feel like a kind of nascent standard for real-time AI. And once we had that sort of nascent standard on the server side, the next piece we started adding about 3 months ago was the client-server communications piece. So now there are open source, like PipeCat, client-side SDKs for web and React and iOS and Android that define all of the events and messages you would want to pass to and from a client in a real-time voice and video call and let you sort of drive the call from the client. And that's unlocked a whole bunch of kind of developer productivity on these use cases as well.
How did it get distributed? So you released it, you didn't push hard on it, and it got a lot of traction. Do you know like where the traction came from? A lot of founders, they build their open source tool and they put a lot of thought, do a nice Hacker News launch, and kind of gets a few stars every day or something. Do you have a theory as to like why it picked up so quickly?
Yeah, so it got a few stars every day for like a few months, and then when OpenAI did the advanced voice previews in May this year, somebody posted about PipeCat to Hacker News, and a whole bunch of the like WhatsApp groups I'm in for like voice AI and stuff got 10x bigger overnight, and the stuff I'd been tweeting about all of a sudden started to get reshared, and that was a real inflection point. Like OpenAI, OpenAI just has such a great like reputation and I think attention spotlight that anything OpenAI does shines on that part of the AI space, that it creates a whole bunch of interest. And so sort of previewing advanced voice but not having any developer tooling around it, well, there was this developer tooling that was kind of ready to go, and that was the inflection point.
Oh, that's super exciting. Is there any use case that you were particularly surprised by that you've seen with PipeCat or otherwise?
So the broad set of stuff that has surprised me, and I think we're still not quite fully. I'm less surprised by it now, but I think there's a lot to think about. I think we're all going to talk to LLMs all the time in the future. I think we're just going to take it for granted in a way we don't yet. And voice is such a good channel for humans to just sort of ideate and feel connected and kind of feel companionship and like process our thoughts. We have a lot of people who've signed up for daily or building on PipeCat that are like solo hackers who are just building some tool for themselves where they talk to an LLM. And sometimes they think about it as a coach, sometimes they think about it as a friend, sometimes they think about it as a therapist, sometimes they think about it as an executive assistant. And I think we're not even starting to think about like how normal it's going to be to talk to an LLM all the time. Like I think we're going to have LLMs in all our group chats. I think we're going to have LLMs in all our professional channels, and we're just going to take it for granted. One piece of that really kind of blew my mind was when we were deploying some of the medical transcription stuff in collaboration with a customer. We built some integrations with their EHR that let the kind of medical transcription bot also like fetch patient data and like doctor schedule and things like that. And it happened to be accessible through telephone connections. And we had a like early trial physician, like a guy in his 60s who just really loves being a doctor, start calling the LLM on his commute and say things like, "Who are my patients this morning?"
Oh.
And the LLM would talk to him about his patients. And we had sort of built all that functionality, but we'd intended it to be used like in the exam room, not as a kind of a medical friend, like a colleague or like a med school buddy for this doctor. But that's how he used it. And I was like, oh, I get it. Like I get why that's compelling. It's part productivity and part I love my job, and it's this new channel for that.
Yeah, I think one of the major innovations in I mean, from ChatGPT was not the LLM really. It was the form factor that allowed people to actually interact with AI for the first time in a very natural way. And it's I think it's surprising to me, and I've had an AI company for years now, that AI has come to us rather than we have gone to AI. It's kind of come in and inhabited our own lives in a, I mean, in what if what you're saying is correct, seemingly in like a very organic way soon, which is I think both like very intriguing and exciting and also very scary because they'll be everywhere and permeate many of the aspects of our of our everyday life. I'm curious if you think that in this future that LLMs will be tuned per person, or if there's going to be like my own individual RAG, so it'll pull all of the kind of relevant context just from my life, or if there's any other kind of like hyper personalization that you expect these LLMs will exhibit.
It sure seems like it because that's so useful. Like I'm the low hanging fruit there is that like I can never find stuff across all the various messaging channels I'm in, right? But you can easily imagine once you have that kind of knowledge store in an LLM how valuable it would be. I now have a to-do list voice client that I wrote for myself, that I talk to every morning and every night, and it helps me like not lose track of not so much individual things because I could sort of do that by hand, but like the big arc of things I'm trying to get done. And it's like a few lines of code on top of PipeCat, and I wrote it myself in like 20 minutes, and it's still really useful. Imagine what like somebody who really focused on that problem
Yeah,
could do with the hyper personalization.
yeah. I mean, it has the real potential to actually change us as well. I mean, if we have that kind of interaction with technology in such a kind of personal and intimate way. I mean, yeah, that's really fascinating. I wanted to maybe wrap up and go into some quick fire questions, but maybe just before I do, I'm curious on what's ahead for Daily and PipeCat. I mean, you mentioned some of the things that you're working on, and obviously the kind of developments in video. I think we're all going to be closely watching. But is there anything else that you have on the horizon, that you see at the moment?
I am excited about the video stuff, but the two other things I find myself thinking a lot about these days, and I think you actually put it better than I have, like we want to help people figure out the next great form factors for voice with LLMs. And as you said, like ChatGPT kind of nailed one particular text interaction form factor that's now becoming multimodal with things like vision and automatic screenshots and all that stuff, and it's amazing. I think there's a similar thing that will happen over the next few months or year with form factors for voice. I think there will be multiple of them, but I think they'll start to get not standardized. Well, that's super exciting, and building the tooling for that is kind of like why I do what I do. The other thing I think is interesting, a little bit longer term, is small models are getting better and better. And I would like to, with the community, figure out how to push the PipeCat architecture towards really great support for hybrid, some stuff happening on device and some stuff happening in the cloud. I don't think anybody's really built tooling for that yet, much less kind of real-time multimodal tooling for that. But we have a bunch of people building like cool hardware devices on top of PipeCat that like are microphones, and they partly do stuff on your iPhone, they partly do stuff in the cloud, and it's the same pattern in my mind as like early voice-to-voice development that led to PipeCat, where there are a bunch of like tricky things, you kind of build them from scratch, and then it becomes like a library and a de facto standard. Feels like the hybrid real-time stuff is right at the very beginning of that process. I think that's super exciting.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that sounds like also a whole universe of use cases can be opened up once these things can really be effectively distilled and distributed in smaller devices on edge, etc.
What about you? What are you obsessed with, like helping to make happen over the next few months?
Well, we're we're really bullish on multimodal, and we've spent quite a bit like investing in how do we think about these kind of native multimodal systems in the future. And we started off in vision, which is a very heavy modality, but
Big data.
yeah, big data, exactly. Just a lot of data, but humans are inherently multimodal, and to make the best decision and to have the best inference, you want to take as much information as you essentially can make available to you, which includes modalities that humans can't natively ingest. And that's where we think these models are going. But the architectures are still early, so it's still a lot of like kind of hackery on that front. But I agree with you when you said that a lot of this will just kind of be natively multimodal in and multimodal out. But we'll see what the likes of OpenAI are cooking on that front. Well, I want to throw a few rapid fire questions, and I think a few of these we've actually already covered. And maybe on the research side of things, is there another big frontier of AI research that you think is interesting? Anything that we haven't touched upon already in the conversation?
There really are so many, but my hot take and the thing I think about all the time is how to keep latency low or make latency even lower while continuing to improve the quality of reasoning, output, script following, all of that of the models. So what I sometimes say to people is I think it's not well enough understood that a huge proportion of the today's monetizable use cases depend a lot more on time to first token than on throughput speed. So almost all the LLM benchmarks you see for performance are tokens per second, which is great, that matters. But for almost everything I do, and I think for a huge proportion of use cases that people are willing to pay for today, time to first token is at least as important as tokens per second. And that feels like kind of the research world is not quite caught up to that commercial adoption pattern. You still see new inference providers stand up their stacks and talk about how good their throughput is, and I'm like, cool, but what's your time to first token? That's what I want to see. So that's my sort of applied research hybrid thing I'd like to see people focus more on.
I think that's a great insight and a nuance that I think is lost. I mean, it was definitely lost on me. So really interesting to kind of to hear that perspective. Maybe kind of a corollary to that is, if you could debunk one myth about AI, what would it be?
I think it might actually be that this stuff's not ready for production use yet. And obviously in the world you and I live in, I think there's a lot of optimism about possibilities for today's technology. But I still have a lot of conversations with customers who are like, well, what about hallucinations? And I'm like, okay, that's a real issue, but if you look at that in the context of whatever you're replacing with an LLM, whether it's a human customer support operator or a database system that does a bad job on search and question answering in text today, just the delta of what you get if you start to invest in these new tools is so big. This stuff is ready, and there aren't blockers to rolling this stuff out other than just people's time getting it into people's hands right now.
Yeah, I mean, human adoption is the biggest bottleneck that we have now in AI. Not any other kind of components of the technology. It's our behavioral and our psychology is the slowest thing.
I think about this every time I ride in a Waymo, which I do 5 or 6 times a week in San Francisco. And then I go somewhere else and somebody's like, oh, you have those Waymos, aren't you afraid to ride in them? And I'm like, no, they are so much safer than the median human driver. I'm thrilled to take a Waymo.
It's a great experience as well. It's very pleasant. Maybe last one. What does AGI mean to you?
Man, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think we have it. But we have it only in the sense that we need to build a bunch of stuff. We need to build full technology stacks. The LLMs are unbelievable building blocks, and then we need to build a bunch of tooling on top of them. We're barely scratching the surface of what you can do with LLMs. You talked about having a personalized, a hyper-personalized kind of companion, assistant, whatever. People are trying to build that, but nobody's quite built the whole thing yet, and it's certainly not a standard component of your operating system yet. But the LLMs are good enough now that you could have that capability built into the operating system, and it would be completely transformative of our lives. And even I think those of us who try really hard to use LLMs at the frontier of their capabilities, like I'm sure you do, I definitely try to. I definitely have the feeling I'm only like scratching like 2% of the
Yeah.
capabilities of these new tools. So I kind of think it's there. We just have to build the whole. It's our job now to build the ecosystem.
All right, you heard it here first, folks. AGI is here, so that's we'll hold you to that. Thank you, Quinn, so much for the conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. It's really cool the things that you're building, and also the insights from your career and previous experience in technology. And yeah, really appreciate the time.
Thank you. It's so much fun to talk to you.
All right, have a great one.